Hello and welcome to today's European SharePoint Office 365 and Azure Community webinar. My name is Shane and I'm delighted to be joined by Ahmed Najjar, MVP InfoWorker Norway, who will be talking to you today about calling APIs, consuming services and exposing data using Power Automate. Remember to join in the conversation about today's webinar on Twitter. Our Twitter handle is @EuropeanSP and our hashtag is ESPC20. Don't forget to check out the Resource Center. This is updated daily with the latest blogs, ebooks, webinars, and how-to videos. Simply visit sharepointeurope.com and click the content link at the top. The ESPC20 online summer sale has landed. Book a tutorial ticket before August 27th and receive a 2-day conference ticket for absolutely free. Check out our website for more information. After the webinar, we will have a questions and answers session. Type any questions you have for Najjar in the questions window. Questions will be selected and answered at the end of the presentation. This webinar will be recorded and added to the Resource Center, where you'll be notified by email when it is available. And now I'm going to pass you over to our webinar presenter, Ahmed Najjar. Hello, Ahmed.
Hello, thank you very much. Okay, so I will be starting, just sharing my presentation. Should be seeing this. All right. Okay, so welcome everybody. Thank you very much for joining this webinar. Something I need to add as well. So I'll be as well doing a workshop during the ESPC as well in October. So make sure that you go check out what are the sessions, what are the sessions out there. A lot of huge connection, a huge collection of speakers is going to be speaking at ESPC. So today's session is going to be about calling APIs, consuming services, and exposing data using Power Automate. So I'll start by introducing myself. So they call me the Flow Jedi. So my name is Ahmed Najjar, and I'm based in Oslo in Norway. I'm a senior consultant at InfoWorker. I'm a business applications MVP, passionate, enthusiastic developer, heart and soul, and over 15 years of experience working with SharePoint and Microsoft-based technologies, working with SharePoint PMP and PowerShell. In addition to that, I do work with Power Automate, Power Apps, and Logic Apps. And I'm a co-organizer for the SharePoint Saturday in Oslo. And this is my Twitter handle. Please feel free to follow me on Twitter or add me on LinkedIn. All right. So to start, let us just to put everybody on the same page, I always start with this introduction about the Power Platform and talk a little bit about it, so to set all expectations before jumping into the core material that we're going to be talking about today. So to help empower your people and to elevate their talents, Microsoft combined these 4 services that you see here with a lot of capabilities. And with the Power Platform does have capabilities that will impress any developer, but still it's also designed to be approachable and accessible for any, we call them power users. And now we talk a little bit about digital transformation. Digital transformation means more efficient use of the data and gain insights with facilities, more intelligent business processes and decision making. However, organizations cannot achieve that because they need a lot of developers, and that's why you have this Power Platform. So it will be approachable with those business users to be able to approach these tools and services and products in the cloud, or to be able to apply their businesses using those tools. So the Power Platform is also a singular low-code platform that spans across, as you can see, the common data service, the Dynamics 365, Azure, and a lot of other tools, so it'd be easy to integrate with those products. So today we're going to be going into a deep dive into the Power Automate, which is the Microsoft services that enables automation for all and serves as a crucial component for the Power Platform. So the Microsoft Power Platform as well tooling makes it possible for you to quickly customize the Microsoft Office 365 and Dynamics 365 and standalone apps, but it doesn't mean that you're actually limited. So you can go beyond the point and click and solve more sophisticated scenarios and empower citizen developers and even developers in the day-to-day tasks that they do. As well, makes it easy for them to build custom connectors to integrate directly with their own services and to extend the server-side logic of the common data service with logic plugins, webhooks, you name it. So in other words, you can extend whatever that you've done with the Power Automate and then take it to the next level as a developer. And this is what we're going to be talking about especially today. So the Power Platform, generally speaking, it consists a lot of connectors. So Power Automate provides an abundance of connectors, and that makes it easy to connect and consume and expose data from cloud and on the prem. So you have the public connectors, built-in connectivity for over 300 cloud services, files, databases, web APIs, etc. And those are seamless hybrid connectivity to on-prem systems via the on-prem data gateway. In addition to that, connect to the service with your own security credentials. And that's when you as well building your own custom connectors that we're going to be talking about during this session as well. So as you can see from what we are talking about here, so solely it's actually based on connectors. So the Power Automate and Power Apps are mainly powered by connectors. So what is a connector? The connector is a wrapper around an API that allows the underlying service to talk to Power Automate and Power Apps. So by definition, they are actually built on top of APIs. So what you see when you're working with, for example, Twitter connector or SharePoint connector, or whatever, a lot of those connectors, so you're basically consuming an API that made available for you inside of the platform. You'll be able to communicate with those APIs. So you don't see how it's actually working behind the scenes, but basically it's an API. So it would be actually a shame if the tool does not actually support consuming data or custom APIs or exposing data outside of their environment boundaries. So luckily, this is not the case, and that's what we're going to be talking about during this session. So let's talk about getting data in and out of Power Automate, and that's what we're going to be talking about, because the Power Automate itself is kind of sort of like an API, if you want to put it in that context, because it's built on connectors, and connectors are in turn are actually APIs. So we want to talk about how to get data in from, for example, an API, or how to get it actually out of Power Automate if you want to treat Power Automate as an API. So the first thing that if we want to get data inside of the Power Automate, so what we could do, we could use the HTTP request, which is a trigger. So there's multiple ways that you could get data in, and that's something that we're going to talk about in the demos in details. The second one is the HTTP connector. So the HTTP connector, after you have done the trigger, let's say that you want to consume a service, or you want to get the data or compare the data inside of your Power Automate, you could do that using the HTTP connector. So after you have done your trigger, there's a step, for example, that you want to call a certain service, you want to do calculation, business validation, whatever, you could use the HTTP connector. And lastly, custom connectors. Custom connectors are connectors that you build yourself if the service that you want to consume is not provided by Microsoft, and that's something that we're going to be talking about in details. In terms of the out, if we want to get data out, so we will use the HTTP response, which basically you could return whatever that you want within the body of the response. So that will be found in the payload once the HTTP response is received. So, but we're going to talk about a little bit more about the HTTP response, because you can't use it by itself if you want to get a response from a service, or you want to get data out. So basically, it needs to be paired with the HTTP request trigger, in that way that you'll be calling or you'll be getting the HTTP response on demand. So we start by the first demo for this webinar, which is the HTTP request trigger. And I'll just go to my Power Automate. So I have prepared a demo for that one, which is the not get items, but this one, create an item in SharePoint by HTTP request. So I'll just open that, we'll go through that, and then we'll demo that. So in here, notice that I do have a URL that I'll be calling. And inside of here, this is how the body will look like. And this is actually a JSON schema of how the object that this, let's say, endpoint is expecting. And of course, that you could change the method that you'll be using. So there's like get, put, patch, delete. So depending on what type of action that you're going to be doing against the URL. And the next step that we'll be doing, we'll be taking this message will be received in the request body, and then we'll put it in here and insert it into SharePoint. And then we'll just do a response that this process have been done successfully. So as you notice in here, it's a very simple flow. I didn't try to make it sophisticated. I didn't want to put some kind of like, security, which we're going to be talking about at the end of this session. But as you can see, this is a very straightforward, and then you call that, you pass in within the body a message, and that message is going to be created inside of SharePoint, and then you will get a response that this is okay, it's been completed successfully. So if there's any questions at this point, please pop them out while we're doing, because this is a session that's going to be a lot of demos in this session. So if you have any questions, or you're thinking about something or whatever, like scenarios, you could just pop them in, and then we can take them as we may have some time during the webinar. So I'll just open Postman, and this is a way that we could just consume the endpoint, and think of this as if that you have a custom application that you have created, whether it's Angular, whether that you've created something with JavaScript, or whether you've created something with .NET. You'll be able to consume this endpoint and do whatever you want. If you want to enter data, for example, into SharePoint, or whatever that you want to do during the process, you could do that using the flow. And again, I repeat that again, you're treating this flow as if it is an endpoint. So we go back here, we need to copy the URL and then go in here. And we need to change the type because this is a post, as you have seen here. And the second thing that we want to do, we want to add the content type because it's actually expecting a JSON payload. So we need to make this as JSON. And this is the only thing that we need to do. Notice that if you have some authorization or you use API management to actually secure this endpoint, you have to add them here, or probably you add them in the authorization. And of course, this is only for testing purposes, I mean Postman. But if you're doing a custom application, then you have to do it in a different way. Of course, you need to take care of the passing the header parameters and the body. So in the body here, so what we want to do, I'll just make it row. I'll just make it as easy as possible. So we have, I think it's called a message. And in the message, I want to say, hello, PSPC webinar. If I could spell that, webinar attendees. All right. So we're all set for now. So we'll send that, and we're supposed to get OK. Okay. And then if we go back again to the messages in here, so we'll have the message inside of here. So imagine that you're doing whatever custom application that you're doing outside the bounds of SharePoint, and you want to for example, consume that service to insert some data into SharePoint, collect some data, whatever you're trying to do. So this is a simple way that you could do that. And as you can see, it's very straightforward, very simple, and you could do that without writing loads of code, because you don't have to worry about writing the code for SharePoint, because it's all handled inside of your flow. All right, so we're done for the first demo. And we move to the next demo, which is the HTTP connector. And as I said before, that if you want to consume some kind of like a code logic, you want to consume an Azure function, or whatever that you want to consume during the process of the flow, you could use the HTTP connector. And in the HTTP connector, so you could call a URI, you pass the headers of if there's any query strings, and then you pass in whatever that you want to pass within the body, so be able to do whatever that you want within the HTTP. So whether you're calling another flow, which is it's treated as an endpoint, or whether you're actually calling an actual service or an Azure function or an API, so it doesn't matter. As long as you are calling an endpoint that is can be called as an API, so you'll be able to do that. So for this demo, I do have another example that I've created, which is, okay, so we'll start by the first one. Okay, so the first one in here, what we've done here is we have an HTTP request. When an HTTP request is received, we have two numbers, and we're treating them as strings. It doesn't matter at this point. You can make them a number, or you could make them as string, because this will be handled using a service that I've created in as an Azure function. So the second thing here, I do have initialized some variables which have the function app URL and the app code, because there's a security. So I'm not going to be showing those. But it's only have the function app URL and the code. The next thing that we have here, so we have an Azure function, as I mentioned before, and it actually takes a post method, and then we have the URL, which is the one that we're getting from the variable, and we have in the query string, we need to send in the code, which is part of the query string to authenticate against the Azure function. And then lastly, in the body, you need to pass in two numbers. So if we go here and look, how does the service look like? And if you have any questions again, so you could just pop them in while we doing the webinar. I could just probably answer them while we go. Definitely, a lot of you have a different scenarios that they've already done, so probably we could help them out with their scenarios. So as you can see here, this is a very simple Azure function. So what you do is just you get the number one and number two that's have been passed in the body, and what you do, you check that it's actually been passed. Otherwise, it will wait. Otherwise, and then it will show the error. Please pass two numbers to on the query string or in the request body. So either you pass them as query strings, or whether you pass them in the body. So it doesn't matter. And then you just do here an addition operation. So you convert that from string to integer 32, and then you send back the result for that. So it's a very straightforward, no hocus pocus here. So I'll get back here and we'll just try to consume this service. So I'll just copy the URL and just go to Postman, and we'll add a new one here and paste this in here. And this is of course a post. In the header, it's expecting JSON, so we'll just change the content type to JSON. And then in the body, what we want to do is we want to send number one and number two. So what we do is just very simple. So we do this, and then we have, okay, num1, and then number one is going to be, for example, let's say 50, and then we'll have another parameter that's going to be sent in the body, and that's it going to be num2, and then inside of here we'll just give, for example, let's say 70, or let's say 80. All right, so we have two numbers in here, and then we're going to send them out, and we're supposed to get the result, but the result's not going to be sent back as a response for this one. This one is going to be just telling us that this is okay, this is going to this has been created. What's going to do is actually it's going to create an item inside of SharePoint, and it's going to say number one and number two, the addition and the output from the compose, which is basically what the service have returned in here. What we could do here is actually add a step in here, and let's say response, and just to we're not getting the response. Let's say HTTP, and then I don't know why we're not getting the response in here. Anyways, so what we could do is actually just send a response in here. I guess that we could just put it over here. Response, there you go. And then in the response that we're gonna say, okay, and this gets returned into the service. And what we want to do is we want to save this, and then I think that we could just put it over here, save, put it at the very end, that everything have been done successfully, and back again in here. I don't know if that's going to change the URL. Hopefully not. I'll just make sure that this didn't change. It didn't change. So we'll just try to consume that, and hopefully we get okay. Then if we get back again to the addition results and then do a refresh, you'll notice here 50 plus 80 is 130. And we were able to consume this Azure function within our flow. Now notice for those that are using Logic Apps, you do have a connector for Azure Functions, so you can just consume that directly. You don't use the HTTP, but in Power Automate, you don't have that facility. So you have to use the HTTP connector to be able to connect to that. So I'll go back again because I do have another demo for that. And notice that we have passed here we have passed the parameters in the body payload, but we are able to send as well parameters to the HTTP request in the query string. So instead of sending that as part of the body, we can send them as a query string. And here's the example for that. So we go to this one, and I think that's the one, and then edit. And in this one, we're doing exactly the same, definitely exactly the same. There's nothing changes, but the only changes that we're doing is we're not actually doing anything in here. And notice that this is gonna be a get, or it could be a post. It doesn't matter because you're sending everything with the query string. So we're doing it as a get at this time. And inside of the get number one, which is the trigger, notice what we have here. So in this one, we have outputs. I'll just remove that to the side and bring that again. Okay, so notice here that we have a trigger, which is the trigger connector, and then we have outputs, and then queries, and then num1. So this string of the URL is expected to have num1 as a query string in the URL. And it does exactly the same as well for num2. So it's outputs, queries, and then num2. And this is how you extract the queries from the HTTP request if you're doing that with Microsoft Flow. So what we're going to do is we're going to take this URL and then go again to Postman and do exactly the same. This is going to be a get, and this is not expecting any content, so we don't need to do anything in here. But what it's expecting is expecting parameters. So what we're going to do here, we're going to have num1, and then we're going to put that as, for example, 100. And then we have num2, and this is going to be, let's say, 80. And then we send that, and hopefully we get OK. This has been done successfully, and then we go here and then refresh that. We get 100 plus 80 is 180. So there's two ways that you could pass parameters, and in that way you could just send in data inside of your flow. If you want to expose data from outside of flow, you could just send them in the payload, or you could send just parameters in the query string. So it depends on what scenario that you're trying to solve. But there's two ways that you could just send in data into your flow. All right. So now we move to the next thing. I don't know if there are any questions. No. All right. Okay.
We just have one question.
Yeah, sure.
And it's basically about, will there be a recording of this? And the answer is yes, there will be a recording of this available later.
That's a very important question. All right. That's good. All right. So everybody needs to just, I don't know if I'm going too fast, if that's going to be as well a note for me, but I do understand that this is a very knowledge-rich session because I'm talking about a lot of things in a lot of scenarios. So that's a good question. All right. So we move now to the custom connectors, extending the data reach. So the first thing that we want to talk about is why building a connector. So the first thing is the enterprise developers. If you're looking for connectivity to a service that is currently not supported by Microsoft. And what we mean by that, like for example, if you are a traffic authority, or you are a company that is, let's say, probably is going to be a governmental that provides some data to the public, probably it would be a good idea to have this as a connector inside of Power Automate, because everybody's going to be consuming that, and then you could just exchange the data and make the exposure even better. Because, for example, traffic services or the traffic authority is an authority that everybody's dependent on. We use our cars every day. We use the trains every day. We use a lot of these transportation means every day. So we need to know the conditions. Are there any delays or something like that? So there's a lot of decisions that are dependent on those things. And if you could just insert that inside of your flow, you'll be able to do something even more fruitful at the end as an end result. So the next thing is if you need connectivity to a custom or an internal service. So for example, if you have an internal service within your company and you want to make that easy to consume for all these Power users in your company or Power developers, so they'll be able to consume those services without the need to understand how you actually build that connector, or there's an underlying API that is doing that work for them. So they don't have to think about how it's actually working behind the scenes. So this is also a good way. We'll talk about that in details at the very end, when to use what, but at least that we could mention that when to use a custom connector, because building a custom connector does take a little bit of time, at least to set up the security right, to set up everything that you want to do right, and to set up all the actions that you want to do, or whether there's triggers going to be as part of that connector. I don't know, that depends on the business scenario that you're trying to solve, but at least that you need to set your mind in the right position when you're, let's say, do I need to build a custom connector or not? The second thing is as for our partners and ISVs, and that's a really good example, the one that I mentioned about the traffic authority. But you also could expand the number of services you integrate with, because that means that everybody's going to be using your service, and then they'll be kind of like, dependencies on your service, more exposure, provide the extensibility to customers as well if they need, and of course, as I mentioned before, increase the exposure and adoption. And something that you probably want to mention here why you would build a custom connector is also to impress your friends. And if your friends are not impressed, I would suggest that you'll find other friends. Okay. All right. Now we'll go to the next demo, which is building a custom connector. And for this one, I think that everybody is familiar with Yelp, which is provide information about a point of interest. So this is the Yelp API, and we're trying to build a custom connector around the Yelp API. So the Yelp API does provide a lot of interesting endpoints here, which is search for businesses, phones, or whatever. What we're trying to do this time, we're trying to search for businesses in this example. And before you start building the custom connector around an API, you need to understand how does the API works. And you need to read the documentation, because a lot of that depends on a lot of those bits and pieces in the documentation, the custom connector will be dependent on. So if we go to Power Automate, and then we go to build a custom connector, and notice that you'll have multiple. Notice that I've done that before multiple times, but we'll do it once again. But notice that you have multiple possibilities. And then exactly the same Azure function that I showed you earlier, you could have it as a custom connector. So you could be able to do that, or whether you have an open API file for your API, you could do that from there. You could do that from a URL. You could do that from an import a Postman collection. But we're going to do today, we're going to start all over from blank. All right, so we're going to call this ESPC underscore webinar, and then continue. At this point, what we want to do is we need to set some general information for the custom connector. And I lost focus. All right. Okay. So now, so what we want to do is we want to set the icon background. So, for example, that we could put some kind of like an image in here. So I do have an image in here, so I'll copy it from there and upload the connector. Sorry, upload connector icon, and it should upload this one. And if you want to change the color for this one, you could do that, make it black or make it white. It doesn't matter. All right. So for this time, we will make it white. And then if you want to add some description for that custom connector, you could just do that for here. If you're connecting to an on-prem API, you could do that from here. You check that, and then you have to go through providing the data gateway that you have defined. Let's say that you do have some APIs that is running on-prem for your company. You could do that from here. So the scheme here, after that, you choose the scheme, whether this is HTTPS or HTTP. So luckily, the one that we are consuming here is HTTP. And then the next thing that we need to get the host. And the way that I knew what the host for this API is by going back to the documentation. And as you can see here, it just says that all Fusion API endpoints are running under this. So this is the only thing that I need to care about. All right, so I'll get back again in here. So we move to security. And for security, again, we need to go back to documentation. And as you can see here, that in the documentation, it says that authenticate API calls with the API key. So apparently that you need an API key. And in order to get an API key, you need to create an account or a developer account with Yelp, and then you'll be able to consume their services. Luckily, I've done that before, but here it says to authenticate API calls with the API key, set the authorization HTTP header as bearer key, and then the key. So what we need to do is we are sending that in the header, so we know that we are sending that in the header. So we go back again and do exactly what it says. So this is going to be an API key, and the parameter label at this point, it does not matter. I could call it SPC key, for example. It doesn't matter. But what matters is actually the parameter name. And the parameter name is authorization, exactly how mentioned in the documentation back here. Sorry. So it says authorization, HTTP in the header, the value of the bearer, and then you pass in the API key. So I'll go back again, and this is in the header. It seems to be fine for me here, so I move on to the next one. So what we want to do here is we want to define the actions and triggers that we want to do with this connector. So a connector, it could consists of several actions, or let's say several triggers. So that depends on how you define this API. So for example, if those APIs does have some kind of like, webhooks, when something happens, it will just send back some payload or return something that you could define some triggers. You could do that. But this time around, so what we're doing, we're going to be only defining an action. So this action is going to be called business search. And for the description, it's going to be exactly the same. And the operation ID is going to be also a business search. All right. So this is for the first part. It's just a general part. You define, for example, a summary, some description about your API they're going to be consuming, and the operation ID. The next thing that we want to do, we want to do a request. And then in this request, we have to go back to the documentation. So we go to the documentation because we're going to be doing some business search. So what it does here, the request is going to be a GET, and it's going to be consuming this URL. But there's also some parameters that could be sent along with the request. And as you can see here, so these parameters should be in the query string. But not all of them are required, but some of them are basically required, because if you're searching for businesses, at least you need to say, I'm searching for burgers, I'm searching for coffee. So this is the least thing that you need to pass in within, and you need to pass in a location. So where are you actually searching for example, let's say you're searching for coffee in New York, you're searching for coffee in Oslo, and so on and so forth. So you need to provide those parameters for the custom when you're doing the call for the API. So if I go back again in here, and from the documentation, this is a GET, and I do understand that there's going to be a URL. So I do have the URL in here. So I'll just copy it from the clipboard and then paste it in here. Okay, and I'll just explain the rest of the this afterwards, but I'll just import in here. And notice that I did pass something within the query string. I did pass the term, I did pass the location, the latitude and longitude. So the term is actually what I'm searching for. The location is where you're actually looking for that point of interest, in which city, for example, in which country. And the last thing, the radius of the search. So this is, you're going to be given a longitude and a latitude. So the longitude and latitude are not actually that important. What we want to do is we want to set these the term as required, because we want to send this for the service. And the second thing that we want to do, we want to set the location as required. And notice here that this is extra information that you could provide for the parameter, and that's something that you need to look into if you're doing that for your company, because that will give metadata for those who are actually trying to consume that connector, consuming that connector. Yeah. So we made the term and location as required. So we don't need the longitude and latitude to be required for now. Now we get to the response on what is the expected response to get back from the service. So what we want to do in here is we want to add a default response, or we could get that from the response in here. So this is the default response, edit, or not, this is not what I'm looking for. I think I add a default response. Okay, so I'll paste it in here. And this is as well as coming from the documentation. So if I go back in here, notice that this is the response body, and this is what expected to come back from that service. And this is what gonna be forming our dynamic data or dynamic content that we call in Microsoft in Power Automate. So in Power Automate, when you consume a connector, and then there will be some properties or content returned with each and every connector, this is what's going to be returned in here, and this is going to form our dynamic content. So if I go back again in here, and I do have the format in here, so I'll just copy that in here and just paste it here in the body and import. This is going to take a while, I think. There we go. So you see that's the default, and then within the body, there's like a several dynamic content that is actually returned within the response. And this is basically what I've actually have passed in as JSON. So we don't need to do anything at this point right now. The only thing that we need to do is just press create the connector. And hopefully this will go through quickly. All right, so this has been successfully verified, so we could go and test it right now. So what we need to do right now is create a connection against the connector, the custom connector, and now it's going to ask me for that key, which is basically the key. And as you notice in there, you'll see that it's the label. It says ESPC key. And then I put in here the key, which is the one that I use for my developer account, and then I create a connection, and hopefully this will work. Just do some refresh, there you go. And then we have a term, let's say that we want, it's about, I don't know, everybody's from different places. I don't know if it's lunchtime, dinner time. So I'm just gonna search for burgers, and the location is gonna be Oslo, and then try to test the operation. And notice here, it returned some businesses. So there we have illegal burger Oslo at some point, and then we have different businesses. So once you've created that, so we have created the connector. So now the connector is going to be available for us in the list of connectors. So let's say that if we went and tried to build a flow. So the flow is going to be, let's say here, term. And then the second one is going to be, let's say that the location is going to be taken from the button. So I'll just delete that. So the next step is going to be ESPC. There you go, ESPC webinar. And then we have business search. And inside of here, we need to pass in the term. The term is going to be taken from the button, and the location is going to be the city from the button. And we don't need to pass in the longitude and latitude. And then what I'm going to do here is compose. And inside the compose, I could just put, for example, businesses, I think. I do have businesses, there you go. So inside of this is going to be a collection of businesses. I could go through them. You could do whatever with them. So I'll just save that and test that. I'll perform the trigger. Continue. Hopefully we'll get that. Okay, allow. And then I will just say again, burgers. Run flow. Done. Oh, it failed for some reason. Okay, so probably this is not getting the city the right way. So we'll just try one more time. We do have some time. So I'll just say, for example, here, Oslo. I'll just save that. and we'll try to test again using this. Let's say it failed again. Okay, so I'll just go through that at some other point, but at least you've seen that the connector is actually working when we've done the test back in the for the API. I don't know what's the error in here, but at least that when we created the connector, you could see that the custom connector is actually working fine. It should be that one. We go to edit and then try to test. Should be working. Yeah, but I don't know what's the issue there, but this should be a straightforward, and hopefully you will not run into what I ran into during the webinar. Okay, so we'll be back to our session and just talk a little bit about in depth about the custom connector. So the connector is in depth. So what happens when you call that connector in Power Automate? Okay, so what we need to do is we have the connector architecture, so whether it's a Power Automate or Power Apps, and then we have a RESTful API. So whether it's a RESTful API, it's an Azure function, it doesn't matter. So what happens in the middle, so we have the API management gateway. So you create a custom connector there, and there's a token store. And you remember that I've actually stored that API there, so it will be stored for you there. And we have already defined a connector ID, an operation, and a connection ID, and that will be sent to the custom connector that is kept in the API management gateway. So the connection ID is sent again to get the credentials to authenticate you against the API. The call is made to the host with the path and the credentials from the token store and the one that you've provided, and then the response then gets back through the gateway back again to the Power Automate and Power Apps. And this is also applies for the custom web APIs, RESTful APIs, and Azure functions. If you're doing that on-prem, is exactly the same. Everything is kept in a token store, but the only thing is this is going to be done through an on-prem data gateway, and that's it. So if you want to make your connector available for everyone, not in your organization, but I mean everyone outside of your organization, you need to certify that from Microsoft. So you develop it, you build a secure and describe your API, import from existing artifacts, or whatever the way that you did it, you test it and validate it, use in Power Automate, in Power Apps, and then you share it with others just to make sure that it's working within organization. And then you could certify it, and then Microsoft would certify your connector. And then your connector will not only be available in Power Automate, but it also is going to be available within Power Apps and Logic Apps. So we reached to the final thing, which is getting the data outside of your Power Automate. So, and as I mentioned earlier, it's only paired with the use of the HTTP request trigger. So it's not going to be a good use that if you actually return a response without a request, because this is how APIs works. So you call something and then something gets back, and this is how the calls works on the web. And it doesn't make any sense if you use the HTTP response only by itself. And this is the way that you could get data outside, is actually when you call something on demand, you get a response on demand. All right, so that's done is actually using the HTTP response in the same way that we've done. If we want to return the, for example, clear text, we've returned, for example, OK in other examples that we've done before, but we could also return some data. So you could just send a response body for the JSON schema and then say this is the data that's going to be returned with the schema. Or you could just, for example, just return a clear JSON, for example, without putting any schema, or you just return text, for example, as OK. So if we go back again to my flows, and then we go, for example, here, and then we go to our flow. Oops. And then we go to our flow. So notice here what I'm doing is I'm just doing a get in here. So I'm calling this URL, and inside of here, I want to get all the messages that I have within the HTTP messages that is filled in within SharePoint. And then in the response, I'm returning the data. So you could make this as a schema if you want to, or you could just return it as JSON, it doesn't matter. You could generate that from a sample the same way that you do it with the request. In the response as well, you could do that. Okay, so what we could do in this one, so we could just copy that guy over here and go again to Postman, and then we do something like that. So we don't need to actually pass in anything in here because we're not passed anything. So we just send that, and we're supposed to get, for example, this is hello world. We have another hello world, and we have hello world 2. And as you notice that we have several oops, I don't know what I've actually done here, but I've clicked on something. All right, there you go. Oh, okay, so and it actually returned all the data that we have inside of the HTTP messages in here. In the same way that if you have some data, for example, in SharePoint, you have data in your to-do list or whatever, and you want to expose it somewhere outside of the bounds of the ecosystem that you're using, and you want to get it into an application, you could do that as well with Power Automate. Now remember, this is where we reach to a point that we need to mention some security measures and some other things. So before we in this session jump into the questions, here what I want to mention. So the first thing that I want to mention, when to use what. So if you're a developer and you want to, let's say, consume some services for a couple of flows, you don't have to build a custom connector for that because you'll be using that yourself, and most probably that you'll be able to understand how to call that. So it's not because there's not a lot of power users that are going to be using those services, and they don't need to kind of like put yourself in a position where you need to do custom connectors and then publish them and do all those tests. So what you need to do is to just use the HTTP connector, and it will be easy for you to do that. So, or you could use a flow that actually have the logic for that services, and then always call that flow instead of reinventing the wheel and repeating that logic over and over again within your flow. But if this is going to be used by let's say the end users and a lot of people that are building flow, and you want to facilitate how they're going to use an API, it's highly recommended that you use a custom connector. Or what you could do is if you are, for example, an authority that provides, let's say, information, say, for example, the Yelp example. So if you want to provide information or search information about points of interest, you could make that as a custom connector, and then will be certified by Microsoft. So everybody will be able to use that service. So this is one way to do that. Now remember, using an HTTP connector within your flow needs a premium license. So if you don't have a premium license, you'll not be able to use custom connectors, or you'll not be able to use the HTTP calls. So that's something that you put at the back of your head when you're trying to build those things. Now, in terms of security, for those who are familiar with Azure, you could use the API management to secure those endpoints that you have built within Microsoft Power Automate. So in Power Automate, those flows that you have built that they have as endpoints, those endpoints will be taken and put inside of the API management, and then you'll use the API management URL that is secured, and then pass in some credentials instead of using the URL that I've copied and pasted inside of Postman. And this is a way that you could secure your calls if you're treating your flows as an endpoint. And with that, I think that I've mentioned most of the things that I want to say for this session. And if you guys have any questions, please feel free to ask them if there's any questions in the list.
Thanks for a great presentation. Yes, now we will start the questions and answers part. And should you wish to ask a question, please type it into the questions window now. Okay, Ahmed, we just have one question in so far, and I think you've slightly touched on it there. Can you please state what license plans are required for the different actions connectors you are using in the demos?
Okay, so in the demos, I've used only one premium connector, which is basically the HTTP call when I did the call against the Azure function, and that one is actually a premium connector. And if I go back to just show that in here, so the SharePoint is not a premium, of course, and this is not. But if we go back again if we go to create, let's say, so instant, and notice that whatever is premium, you'll see that it's actually premium. But if I go to my flows and I go to which one is it? This one, I think, and then edit, and notice that this one is actually a premium connector. So when I want to add an HTTP, notice that this will come up as a premium connector. And if you want to invoke an HTTP request to, for example, Azure AD, whatever, so you'll notice that those are actually, if you're using those APIs, those are premium, but no, those ones are premium. The other ones I've used, none of them are premium. No, using custom connectors is actually premium. So you need a premium license to be able to consume custom connectors.
Okay, is the premium license needed only for the Flow developer or for all users?
So this questions have been asked multiple times, and as for now, I remember that I think that is needed for everyone that's going to be consuming that flow. So for example, if that flow is going to be consumed by, for example, let's say 30 users, and all those 30 users needs to be using that connector, and if they don't have a license, premium license, they will not be able to run that. I think I ran into something like that. I'm not sure if that's a bug or it should be like that, like everybody wants to use that, should be have a premium license or not. But because I do have premium license in here, so I didn't run actually into that problem. But I remember that somebody that was using it, some of our clients, does not have a premium license, and they wanted to consume some flow, and they didn't have a premium license. So we built it as we developers, we built it with a premium license. They were not able to access that. So I'm assuming the short answer is yes, they need.
Great. Okay, that's it for the questions, Ahmed. On behalf of the ESPC community, thank you for taking the time today to complete this webinar. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you very much for asking me to do the webinar.
No problem. Okay, just bear with me here as I get back to my own screen. And we'll just move on. Okay, this is the end of the webinar today. Please join us next week for Security Options Center for reactive to proactive using Azure Sentinel. Thank you again to Ahmed Najjar, and thank you for joining us today. Take care and goodbye.